Hey, this is Ramon, Challenge Alpha 4. And so let's go chapter 4, Genesis, Cain and Abel. So Cain is basically the Hebrew word for I produced, and Abel is the word for vanity or emptiness. And that can be seen as their destinies in the story. But a lot of the characters who appear in the Old Testament are actually known by their name. So their action is their name. So, like, um, Moses' name will mean something, Noah's name will mean something, and that name also corresponds to what they do. So, like Adam, ground, he comes from the ground. Get it? Okay. So then we get into Cain's generations. And this is a list that corresponds from Genesis 5, and it parallels the Mesopotamian kings list, which I got into last video. Uh, the story, but also in this story, as it begins to unfold, Cain and Abel, is that you also see that this creation myth, or this part of the origin myth, was not part of the original myth. And you can see that by the fact that there's an unexplained presence of a broader yet unnamed population. And that hints that there's a greater story here that is not connected to this tale anymore, the tale of Cain and Abel. This disconnect in the story is further highlighted by the fact that certain ancestors are the patriarchs of certain types of arts and skills. So you have the ancestor of musicians, and the ancestor of metal workers, and the ancestor of farmers, and the ancestors of herdsmen. So that hints even more heavily at the fact that this would not be in the story, and it would not be worded that way if in just a few chapters ahead a flood was about to wipe everybody off out of the world. Then why include that? So it shows that these tales were not originally directly connected to each other the way that they're compiled now. Also of note is that the creation of the arts here is granted to humanity, is granted to humans. That's a great departure from other myths at that time. Just think of, for those who are more familiar with, just think of the Greek myths, how it's the gods who gift these skills and attributes to people, while here it is humanity that creates these skills and attributes. So that is a great departure from the other myths. And in the Mesopotamian, you'll have gods of music and gods of dance. Well, here, you're just getting people creating dance and creating art and creating occupations. And these gifts are not the gifts of the divinities. These gifts here are man-made or man-produced. And that's a great departure from all the other religious ideas of faith at that time. So that's incredibly interesting to see. And then here in the Hebrew at verse 24, we also see the first mention of God in a term that we would call him. In the priestly tradition, that won't actually happen until Exodus 6. So you can see the different texts now combined into one text. And basically this is because, we know this because different surviving versions of the text differ in word usage. So you'll see some versions where God, as we would use the word God, doesn't show up until Exodus 6. And then other versions where his name shows up as early as chapter 4, verse 24. So you can see different texts. And that's an interesting side note to how these stories were constructed when they were compiled specifically. And then we get into from that the understanding of the text. So a very simple interpretation is that this is a story about jealousy and a warning against jealousy. That's the simple explanation for Cain and Abel. But a more complex read is that it is the struggle between farmers and the nomadic hunter-gatherers, and how that struggle expressed itself in the stories of civilization and the myths of the community. But a more religious read is that this shows God's eventual distaste or dissatisfaction with human sacrifice. And then a, a more Christian read would be that this reading is one of the first testaments to God's grace, and how no one can know who will be preferred, or as we would use the term now, saved, by God's will, no matter the works that are done. So even though Cain does all these great works and sacrifices what he believes is the correct sacrifice, God prefers Abel's sacrifice. So that's an interesting read or take on the story. Anyway, catch you guys in the next one.